audience, and myself have plenty of those. I wanted to say a few words about USAID and how USAID has really been striving to include the private sector and to catalyze private sector investment into sectors that are really important to poverty reduction. I think this will serve as a good framework for some of the discussion with the panelists, because we are working with all of these organizations on a daily basis to really improve the lives, especially in places like Africa. USAID really has been one of the first organizations which throughout its history has tried to incorporate work with the private sector into its activities. We first started with enabling environment for small businesses and SME support. Very quickly realized that the better way, instead of just providing grants, would be to start sharing risk with the private sector. So we started doing guarantees in which we partner with local and international banks to enable them to take on more risk when lending to important sectors and smaller businesses. So we're helping them become more inclusive. At the same time, we also started the Global Development Alliance, which is also a partnership model that we actually do with a lot of corporations, where we partner to jointly solve development problems. And we've actually taken that model to the next level very recently when we launched the Global Development Lab, which includes Unilever as its cornerstone partner. And really what it's trying to do is catalyze not only capital, but really the thinking that private sector brings, the kind of the problem-solving skills that the private sector brings to the development agenda, and tries to align the interests of development and the private sector in that way. We've also started doing a lot of work with investment funds. We've recently, in the Middle East, launched an initiative which is supporting several funds and financial institutions that will be investing in startup and small businesses. And what we're really trying to deal with right now is the challenge of how do we scale it up. So we've done a lot of partnerships. We've really done a lot of good work. But how do we institutionalize that so it really becomes the core of what the agency is doing? And the question that I would love to pose to all the panelists as you make your remarks and answer the questions is, should donors be in this role? Should they really be catalyzing capital? Should they be working with corporations, and why? Why does it really make sense? Is there any data that shows that when you align these interests and when you work together, this is actually a value add and not just more work for both you and us? Because obviously partnerships take a lot of work. So in that frame of mind, I'll first turn to Maureen. And, Standard Bank has really been a great partner, both for our guarantees and, for example, with Power Africa, which is another great model of how USAID is working with the private sector, catalyzing lots of investment, including significant amounts from your bank. Can you speak a little bit about why you feel that partnerships, why do you enter into these partnerships? Why do you spend time talking to us and providing all the input that you do on the energy sector, on the agriculture sector in developing countries? How does that help your business?
Thanks, Agnes. I guess what I would say is that it's because our interests are aligned. It is in our fundamental interest that USAID succeeds, and it's in their interest that we do as well. And I think that's when you find unique opportunities for partnerships. I had the pleasure of serving as part of the team that started up the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and one of my jobs there was sort of trying to help catalyze private sector investment on behalf of the U.S. government. So believe me, I know how hard this is to do. And I think what Power Africa has done is very powerful. And maybe I can put it into three sort of categories of why Standard Bank has decided to partner in such a fundamental way with USAID on this initiative. The first is going back to Miguel's point about how we just can't do this alone. When you look at the challenges of investing as a bank or as a developer or an equity sponsor into big power projects on the continent, you can't do these projects by yourself because you're operating in a regulatory environment that you can't separate your projects from. Oftentimes you have a government utility that's the off-taker. There are issues around cost-reflective tariffs that are fundamental to the ability to finance these kinds of deals. And as a bank, it's very difficult for us to go into a government utility or Ministry of Finance and say, here's the XYZ things that need to be done, although we have these conversations all the time. But we don't really have any way to help facilitate the change. And I think what Power Africa has had an interesting ability to do is to bring the power of the U.S. government to use their own resources to pay for transaction advisors who are working inside government ministries. USAID took the time to really listen to what our bank had to say around what the key constraints are, and we feel like they really heard us, and we're starting to see some changes, that the U.S. government is helping African governments to implement some of the policy reforms that will unlock our financing. You see the recent compact that the Millennium Challenge Corporation signed with the government of Ghana. It's $500 million of grant money to support the strengthening of the Ghanaian electric utility. That is not money that the private sector can come up with to help facilitate those changes. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's also purchasing expertise that we really don't have in spare capacity inside the bank. So for us, it was really, when Power Africa was first announced, it's kind of funny as an American inside an African institution, and it's my government that's coming up with this big partnership, and I used to work for the U.S. government, and here comes Maureen to say we need to partner with the U.S. government on this thing. I was expecting a little bit of pushback, and to be quite honest, at the very highest levels of the bank, the question wasn't why should we do this, it was how. And how can we help? Because there was this moment in time where the U.S. government was really willing to put some resources and time and expertise to solve the problems which we can't as private sector, which is a lot of the issues around government capacity, the regulatory environment. So that's the first example I'd give. The second, you heard a little bit about lunch today, which was, Andy gave some examples around what the U.S. government has been able to do in terms of leveraging other donor agencies to put money on the table for power. And that is also very powerful because even if the U.S. government doesn't spend a cent on Power Africa in terms of financing the deals, the work that they've been able to do to incentivize the World Bank to bring their expertise, the African Development Bank, the government of Sweden to bring their guarantees, it's such a powerful it's a powerful tool for a bank like ours where investing in power on the continent is one of our key priorities. The other thing I would say is that the U.S. government has had a lot of success in terms of helping U.S. companies who maybe weren't looking at the opportunity in Africa and the power space to see how real it is. And in turn, that's very helpful to us when, I'm one person sitting in New York trying to understand the whole U.S. power market and which companies are interested in Africa and who should we be talking to and how do we find that kind of needle in the haystack of the American company that really wants to be investing in power or selling products or putting their own equity in deals. And I think the U.S. government and that convening authority, not just with donors, but with the private sector, has also really helped save us time and effort in terms of finding who the right, partners are for us to be working with. And then the last thing I would say, it's really around something Agnes mentioned earlier and has been coming up throughout the course of the day. It's around allocating risk properly. And as much as Africa's largest bank, it is part of our core values to be sort of testing new business models, to trying to find ways to reach new levels of society with banking products, whether it's just a simple account or a loan or lending to new sectors that we hadn't been able to before. Those credit enhancements that the U.S. government and other donors have are not only important, they're critical. And I think about the long-term project finance deals that we've been doing in Africa over time. There aren't many that don't have DFI participation. It's the long tenors that the DFIs can bring to the table, the sovereign risk that governments can take on that banks never could. They become a but-for in that case. But for DFI involvement, we wouldn't be able to make these kinds of investments. When it comes to the USAID guarantee and the sharing of risk that the U.S. government can offer through USAID, it's slightly different because you could never take a credit enhancement like that and layer it on a deal that didn't make sense on its own. But what it does do is help us to maybe look at customers where there's a little bit more risk than we would normally be comfortable with. And that is also very powerful when you try and think about the poverty reduction elements of what we're trying to do in the power space. So, I mean, there are lots of ways, and we could talk about all sorts of sectors where the bank can find working with donors critical. But I think Power Africa is a great way to tell the story because it touches the bank in so many critical ways. So from our point of view, the answer is, should donors be playing this role? Absolutely. And number two, is that there evidence that it's working? Yes. I mean, we probably could provide some of that to you guys to tell the story. But I think particularly when you're working in some of those tough sectors and tough regulatory environments, without the donors, a lot of the things that we'd be doing would be very difficult to close. And at the end of the day, without power in Africa, it's a constraint to almost every sector, to almost every business, to every household. So it's critical.
Great. Thank you. Miguel, we've heard a lot of really great positives from Maureen about how donors are helping. And I know that we're working with you when it comes to smallholder farmers and health and hygiene activities. My question is, so I'm sure you can give us lots of stories about how we're able to allow your company to stretch further, and we want to hear those. But also if you can include a little bit of challenges about things that you wish you were able to do and you wish that the donors would kind of help you do, but we're not maybe stepping up to the plate yet to do that.
Okay, thank you. So it's a good cop, bad cop routine, I guess. I really have to echo a little bit of what Maureen said. I can't let that go. This alignment of interest, I think, is really the key piece. A number of the thematic areas that USAID has identified as key priorities very much align with the things that I set out at the beginning of my intervention around what we as a business are engaging in. So this, for us, isn't about some sort of CSR activity that we're doing. This is really pretty core to what we do as a company, and it's pretty much core to our business growth strategy. And that's really also important to understand, that this is a driver of growth for us. What was said earlier about the environment in Africa being a very positive environment and Africa being able to stand up on its own 2 feet and do more, I agree. I'm always struck by the huge amount of optimism that is there every time I visit the continent of Africa. Different countries in Africa, you have a sense that it's Africa's time and that things are changing. But there are these undercurrents of things I said in my intervention around access to energy, access to water, basic sanitation, all these sorts of things which actually you cannot find simple solutions to. And governments on their own don't know how to do it. The private sector, we are a player in this space, but we don't always know how to do it either, who to engage with. There are these ecosystems that somehow have to come together to figure out what to do. And I guess that's where the role of a donor organization like USAID and others is quite critical, because you can actually broker a number of these relationships, and to some degree you have the ability to do that in a more neutral way than perhaps us as a private sector company trying to do that from a Unilever point of view. You can bring together communities who would feel more comfortable engaging with you and other donor agencies than they would if a Unilever tried to convene that meeting. And so there is something around the building of these trusted relationships which have to evolve in order to enable us to get from where we are today to where we want to be. So a lot of it is, I think, this catalyzing role that organizations like USAID can provide. Also, you can help accelerate the pace. Things that have taken a long time, slowed to a degree, you can actually, by bringing not just your capital, and it's not about necessarily the capital that you bring as USAID, it's the knowledge, the experience, the expertise, capacity building for governments. I mean, a big challenge in many governments is just that they don't always have the in-house expertise and the knowledge to do this. So if they can get that from donor governments to help them, that unlocks a lot of the things that we then as the private sector can then work with governments to also to move the agenda forwards on. I think also scaling. I mean, we always talk about scale. The majority, I've always used this term pilotititis, which is what it feels like. It feels like we all do really good pilots, and then we're all trying to figure out how to go from a pilot to scalable models. And we always know there are these things which somehow are the blockers to these good ideas transferring from a pilot scheme in a particular part of a country to something which you can take at a regional level and then apply at a national level. And so there's something around how do we now broker these ecosystem-type models, which I've said, to really move things to a scalable level. So that's, I think, where you are in the sort of mix of what you can do. So what are the things that are hard or more challenging about the relationships? I think sometimes it's difficult to... I think all organizations are structured often in kind of silos. That's true of governments. It's also true of companies. And so how do we break through these silos? Because a lot of the things that we're trying to work on are cross-cutting. They're not in silos. So if you look at water, sanitation and hygiene, we talk increasingly about a need for a WASH agenda. It's no good giving one village access to a water well with clean water, but then not educating them or providing them with basic sanitation or educating them on basic hygiene, because you won't solve the problem. So you have to have more integrated ways of working within in an intra-agency and in an agency environment. We in business and the way that we work, we similarly have to find those smart ways of really looking beyond the sort of the narrow silos. The second piece, I think, is around just the mindsets. A lot of people in government environments tend to have longer time frames and tend to think in, the first year or two, we need to do a feasibility study. Then year 3, we need to think about what we might do. Then year 4, we might start doing something. In a corporate world, year 1 is when you start doing something, and you just have a different approach to how we tend to look at things. So sometimes, how do we bridge this difference of view and talk the same language? I think is one of the challenges sometimes in how we make these projects often kind of come together and work.
And maybe that's the idea of creating the ecosystem, where everyone starts speaking the same language and really aligning interests. And I think Maureen mentioned Power Africa. So is your suggestion that this sort of creation of an ecosystem where donors, private sector, and the governments of the host countries can actually work together to create joint solutions?
And I would add civil society. I would definitely add civil society as a really critical partner in this process. And I don't just mean, I mean civil society in its broadest sense, including local community organizations, local bodies that represent the voice of the unheard often. Right. I think it's very important that you engage in those as well as part of this process.